Hey guys, today I bring you the story of Orion Calloway, a 17-year-old boy who faced death and came back with a terrifying vision. He saw priests burning in a hell that exposed the hidden hypocrisy behind their actions. What Orion discovered on the other side challenges everything you believe and will leave you speechless. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss this impactful story. Let's get started. My name is Orion Calloway. And if you were in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the late 1970s, you might have seen me like any other rebellious teenager of the time. At 17, I was a tall, thin boy with shaggy brown hair that fell over my eyes like a curtain, hiding a look that others rarely noticed. It was the look of someone on the verge of a fall, always looking for something that he himself couldn't define. My family had moved from Elmwood, a small, quiet town, to Milwaukee when I was 15 years old. My older brothers, all 5 of them, were already on their own journeys, college, work, some even married. That left me, the youngest, the forgotten one. The house, large and full of corridors that echoed footsteps, looked like a mausoleum. My father, Silas Calloway, was a man with a deep voice and a strong presence. He worked in metal foundry, his broad shoulders marked by years of physical exertion. Our relationship, however, was as cold as the metal he shaped. "Orion, I already told you about wandering around at night," my father said, barely looking up from the newspaper as the clock in the living room showed 9 p.m. He didn't need to ask where I was going or what I intended to do. Our dialogues were always limited to what was necessary. When I walked out the door that night, I felt the invisible tension hanging between us, as thick as the air of a storm about to break. My mother, in contrast, was a vague memory of sweeter times. He had passed away when I was just 6 years old, and his absence was a perennial shadow in the hallways of our house. On nights like that, I felt crushed by the silence and the weight of unspoken expectations. I felt that the eyes of the family portraits pinned to the wall were following me, judging me for being the only one who had not yet found his way. The city outside offered a kind of dark solace. The neon signs, the damp streets, and the dark alleys were scenes that reflected my restless mind. Milwaukee at night had a rough charm, with the sound of cars passing by and the occasional bark of a stray neighborhood dog. It was there, in the midst of loneliness and the desire to escape myself, that the impulse to take my father's car began to take shape. The roar of the engine would be my voice on a silent night, and the speed would be my release from a life trapped within the 4 walls of the Calloway home. That particular night, I was gripped by a restlessness that bordered on unbearable. It was a mix of anger, sadness, and something I couldn't name, a shadow that whispered in my ear that life was more than that, more than the footsteps echoing in the hallway, more than my father's absent glances. My breathing was heavy, and the hand holding my father's car key was shaking slightly. The sound of the key clinking against the keychain was like a drum that marked the beginning of something inevitable. "Orion, where do you think you're going?" Silas's deep voice echoed through the house when he saw me with the key in my hand. His eyes, as gray as the cloudy sky, narrowed, but there were no more words. Silas was not a man of long sermons. Their disappointment was expressed in silences and looks. For a second I hesitated, but the need to flee was greater than any fear I might have had of reprimand. I opened the garage door and smelled the smell of oil and metal that always reminded me of my father. The Plymouth Barracuda, with its 400 cubic inch engine, looked like a sleeping predator. I started it, and the low roar of the engine made my heart race. I pulled out of the garage without looking back, the echo of the wheels spinning on the concrete floor still ringing in my ears as I turned the corner. The streets of Milwaukee were a mix of shadows and flashing lights. I passed flashing neon bars and alleys where solitary figures moved. The radio was playing a song that I barely heard, lost between the roar of the engine and the chaotic thoughts that dominated me. I was accelerating for no reason, but the wind coming through the open window and the sound of the tires against the asphalt were a comfort that almost made me feel alive. But the flight forward comes at a price. I didn't notice when I went over the speed limit, when the speedometer jumped to numbers that my brain registered without processing. A cold adrenaline shot up my spine when I saw the headlights of a car approaching in the opposite lane. The 2-lane road was narrow, and the movement of cars in the distance became a palpable threat. At that moment, I felt extreme nervousness, as if the universe was conspiring to push me to the edge of the abyss. The car ahead looked like a rapidly growing blur of light, and my mind froze, torn between fighting for control and simply giving in. The moment when the headlights of the car coming towards me approached seemed to last for an eternity. Every detail was incredibly clear. The reflection of the lights in the raindrops on the windshield, the sound of the Barracuda's engine roaring like a beast that sensed danger, and the crushing silence that followed my internal scream. I felt a force pull me, as if gravity had lost its hold on my body. Suddenly, I wasn't holding the steering wheel anymore. I was above, watching the scene like a helpless spectator. My physical body was still there, arms stretched out in an attempt to control the car, but my essence, my consciousness, had been thrown out. The darkness around me was deep, but curiously calm, like the embrace of a void that welcomed me. It was the antithesis of the chaos on the road, a space of absolute serenity. In the center of that darkness, a light began to pulse, not in a threatening way, but with a softness that invited curiosity. The light unfolded, revealing a large room, with an antique round wooden table, carved with intricate details that seemed to tell stories from generations past. Around the table, figures I recognized as my ancestors watched me. They didn't wear ordinary clothes. Their clothes were a mix of historical costumes, as if each one represented a different era in our lineage. Their leader, Elder Calloway, had a thick beard and eyes so deep they seemed to contain time itself. "Orion, the time has come to choose," said Elder Calloway, his voice echoing through the room and resonating within me. It wasn't a question, but a statement that demanded an answer. I felt a weight in my chest, as if I were in the presence of judges whose verdict was about to be handed down. Before he could respond, an intense heat invaded the room, and behind Elder Calloway, a scene formed. It was a burning fire, a hell where figures in priestly robes screamed in agony. I recognized some religious symbols on their clothing and understood, in a stroke of understanding that left me breathless, that these men were there not because of their beliefs, but because of their lies. They were prisoners of their own hypocrisy, punished not for words spoken but for the falsehood of their actions. My spiritual heart quickened, if that was possible outside the body. Elder Calloway looked at me, the gravity of his expression weighing on me like an invisible current. "That's what happens when you live without truth," he continued. "You, Orion, still have a chance to make a different choice." The sight of the priests, their shrill voices melding into a lament that seemed to echo in the darkest corners of my soul, made me understand something I had never considered. Life is not about the appearance of faith, but about the substance of it. And there, in that ethereal judgment room, I felt a guilt and purpose so strong it left me speechless. The sight of hell before me was enough to freeze any thoughts of self-pity or rebellion that might still have remained in my mind. The fire was so real that I could almost feel its heat, but it was the sound that impacted me most. The screams, the desperate wails of those men dressed as spirit guides, their faces contorted in agony and regret. Each scream seemed to bring with it a warning for the kind of life that leads to that fate. Elder Calloway leaned forward, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that pierced my soul. "Orion, choices have consequences," he said, his voice reverberating through the room. "We are not here to judge with condemnation, but to show what you can avoid, if you so choose." I looked around, noticing that the other ancestors also had serious but serene expressions. Nobody there intimidated me. They just waited, as if the outcome was in my hands and I was solely responsible for shaping it. Elder Calloway's words echoed in my mind, intertwined with the sound of screams that still resonated in the fiery scene behind him. It was not just a warning about religion, but about the authenticity of life, the sincerity with which one lives and expresses faith. For the first time in a long time, I felt a calm grow inside me, a certainty that replaced the confusion. My voice was low, almost a whisper, but loaded with meaning. "If anyone has to pay for what I did, let it be me," I declared, facing Elder Calloway. "I don't want others to get hurt because of me." He exchanged a glance with the others around the table, and for an instant, all the ancient faces seemed to relax, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. There was no celebration or relief evident, just a barely perceptible nod from Elder Calloway. "So be it," he said, with a tone that sounded like a blessing and a sentence at the same time. The room began to dissolve, the heat of hell and the surrounding darkness fading into a haze that pulled me back, sucking my consciousness into a place where the sound of engines and the smell of burning metal awaited me. The return was abrupt. like an electric shock waking someone up from a nightmare. When I regained consciousness, my hands were firmly on the steering wheel, and my eyes, now wide, saw the road unfolding before me in an instant that seemed to last an eternity. Everything was in motion, but my mind was clearer than ever. It was time to act. Returning to my body was like diving into icy waters after being immersed in a serene, formless darkness. I felt every nerve and muscle awaken in a single instant of impact, as if my spiritual and physical being merged in an explosion of energy. My eyes opened in a frantic blink, and the sound around me returned with overwhelming intensity. The roar of the Barracuda's engine, the skidding tires, and the headlights of the approaching car, now so close that their details became visible. A Chevy Caprice with an equally scared driver. The hands holding the steering wheel felt like they belonged to someone else, but I felt a force guiding them. It was as if someone or something was acting through me, and my body, despite the terror, reacted with precision. I pulled the steering wheel to the right, and the car responded with a jump, leaving the asphalt road and plunging into a grassy field. Time, which moments before dragged on like honey, suddenly soared. The grass wet with night dew crunched under the tires, and I felt the car slide sideways, a chaotic dance between control and chaos. The impact I expected never came. The Barracuda finally stopped, the engine still roaring in protest as my breath exploded in rapid, uncontrolled gasps. For a few seconds, I stood there, fingers still firmly gripped on the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the darkness before me, which seemed to pulse with life. The wet field reflected the lights of the cars that had stopped on the road, like spectators of an unexpected drama. "My God," I whispered, without even realizing that the words had escaped my mouth. The taste of fear was still on my tongue, but there was something else there, something that was new, a sense of purpose, an understanding that I hadn't had before. The sound of car doors opening and voices calling in the distance broke the silence. Other people on the road had seen the scene and were approaching with cautious steps. The glow of the headlights illuminated my face and the interior of the car, making the moment surreal, as if I were a ghost emerging from a nightmare. "Hey, kid, are you okay?" shouted an older man, his voice mixing concern and disbelief. I nodded slowly, still speechless, as my mind raced to understand what had just happened. I was alive. More than that, I was awake, and for the first time in a long time, I knew there was something more to be done with the life I had almost lost. Sitting in the stopped car, still shaking from the adrenaline that was coursing through my veins, I felt my heartbeat slow down. The world around them was silent again, but this time it was a different silence, not one of oppression and loneliness, but one of newfound peace. The glare from other cars and headlights bathed the damp field in which I had stopped, creating shadows that danced in an irregular ballet. It was as if the entire universe had paused to watch what I would do next. The experience I had just had was not something I could simply forget. Elder Calloway's face was still etched in my mind, his eyes carrying a wisdom and challenge that echoed in the depths of my soul, and the screams of the priests burning amid the flames still echoed. A grim reminder that true faith was not something superficial, but a journey of honesty with oneself and the divine. "Why me?" I murmured into the void, my voice barely audible. I felt a wave of emotion wash over me, a mix of relief, gratitude, and guilt. I had come so close to destroying not only my life, but the lives of other innocent people on the road. And yet, something, or someone, had guided me back, giving me a second chance. When I finally managed to get out of the car, the cold night air bit my face. I looked at the stars, which shone indifferently and majestically. For the first time, I felt a connection to something greater, as if those stars were witnesses to my silent promise. I knew I could no longer live as I had before, ignoring the voice that always whispered of a greater purpose, a deeper truth. The memory of the round table and the ancestral faces gave me a new understanding. These men and women, whom I only knew through family stories, were there to show me that living without purpose and without truth was a form of death in itself. And the hell I saw, the souls in agony, was a representation not just of religious hypocrisy, but of any life lived in a false and empty way. I walked slowly back to the road, where a few people were still gathered, exchanging worried looks and whispers that barely reached me. The feeling of being guided, of having been spared, left an indelible mark. I understood then that this near-death experience was not just a warning, but a calling to abandon the lies I told myself, and pursue a more authentic life, a life where serving others and seeking the truth were more important than anything else. I took one last look at the Barracuda, which looked less like an escape machine and more like a symbol of what I was leaving behind. In the days following that night, my every thought went back to what I had seen and felt. The world seemed different, sharper, more real, as if every detail carried a hidden meaning that had previously eluded me. The routine conversations, the smiles of strangers, even the sound of leaves moving in the wind, everything seemed to be part of a symphony that I was finally beginning to understand. I found myself reflecting on Elder Calloway's words and the scene I witnessed. The sight of priests burning in flames was not a judgment exclusive to religious leaders. It was a metaphor for anyone who lived with a mask, who said one thing and did another. It was a reminder that true faith cannot be faked, and that God, however one imagines him, looks beyond the empty rituals and ceremonies. He looks at the heart, at the actions we reflect in the world. "Orion, you've been quiet lately," my father, Silas Calloway, commented one night as we passed through dinner in silence. He had never been a man of many words, but even he noticed the change in me. I looked at him, realizing for the first time that behind his toughness there was also the struggle of a man who carried his family's burden alone. We had never talked about my mother after she passed, but in that moment, I saw in her eyes the same pain that I carried, only masked by severity and hard work. "I'm thinking about doing something different, Dad," I replied, not knowing exactly what those words meant, but feeling they were the truth. He just nodded, an almost imperceptible movement, but one that felt like silent permission. The understanding I gained from that near-death experience was that true faith was like a lighthouse that guided through the storms of life, but that lighthouse could only shine when it was fueled by sincerity and actions. I saw that God was not a distant, stern figure, but a caring Father, deeply connected to human emotions and endeavors. When we live truly, our existence touches the divine in a way that transcends human understanding. This realization didn't make me run to the nearest church or cling to dogma. On the contrary, she made me realize that faith is practical. It is action. It is caring for others and for yourself with the same intensity. That life, at its essence, is a cycle of love, learning and service, and that every little choice counts. That experience taught me that the hell I saw was the reflection of an inauthentic life, and that paradise was something that was built with daily actions, with gestures of kindness, and the search for truth. In the end, I discovered that living for yourself is a lonely path, but living for others is the key to a deep connection with the divine and with one's own self. Time passed, but the memory of that night and the lessons I learned never faded. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the burning fire and hear the screams of men who lived a hollow faith. More than fear, that vision awakened a responsibility in me. I understood that my actions and choices, no matter how small, had an impact not only on my life, but also on something bigger, something that reverberated in the very essence of the world around me. I started talking to other people about the experience, at first in a subtle and discreet way, in conversations with friends and acquaintances. It wasn't easy at the beginning. Milwaukee, although a vibrant city, was not a place where stories of spiritual experiences were freely discussed. However, as I opened up, I discovered that many people carried their own questions, their own doubts about life, faith, and what was happening beyond what the eyes could see. "What do you think it means to truly live, Orion?" asked an old acquaintance and Peter, once while we were in a cafe. He was a friend of my older brother's, but he always took an interest in my thoughts after I started talking more about my thoughts. "Truly living is recognizing that everything we do matters," I replied, looking at the bottom of my black coffee, where small ripples reflected the ambient lights. Not just for us, but for those we touch, directly or indirectly. And that, above all, our actions can comfort or sadden God himself. He frowned, and for a moment I thought I had said something he couldn't understand, but then he let out a slight smile and shook his head. "You know, I never thought of it like that, as if our actions were a form of dialogue with the divine." That was the message I wanted everyone to understand, that God, in whatever form he was understood, whether as a loving father, a cosmic force, or an inner guide, was not a distant, impassive spectator. He was sensitive to our choices, our well-being, and responded with emotions that I was only now beginning to understand. The tears of compassion and joy I felt in moments of true connection were not mine alone. They were a reflection of the divine within me. I began attending community meetings, sharing my story, and encouraging others to reflect on their own lives. My message was clear: living in harmony, serving others, and seeking the truth was not just a matter of personal happiness, but a way of comforting and aligning with divine will. That vision of priests in agony served as a constant reminder that living to please others or following empty rituals was a path to spiritual disconnection. I came to believe that every gesture, every word, and every choice was an act of communion with the divine, that life, in its essence, was a continuous prayer, and that it is up to us to decide whether this prayer would be a song of love and truth or an empty echo of appearances. The impact of that night went far beyond the following weeks or months. The experience I had transformed the course of my entire life. Before, my future was a nebulous field, full of uncertainties and dangerous impulses. But after that night, it became clear that my journey would no longer be driven by desperation or aimless rebellion. I had found something bigger that guided me, a quiet mission to live authentically and inspire others to do the same. Shortly after that incident, I made a drastic decision. I dropped out of conventional school and enrolled in self-study programs that combined philosophy, theology, and community practices. I exchanged hours in classrooms for conversations with older people, listened to stories of faith and trials, and sought to understand different views on what it meant to live well. I worked in shelters, helped with community projects, and spent entire afternoons just listening to those who had no one to pay attention to their words. My brothers, who previously saw me as the troubled youngest, began to notice the change. At a family dinner, my older sister Elizabeth looked at me with eyes that mixed surprise and pride. "You've changed so much, Orion. I remember when you barely spoke to us, and now it seems like you always have something to say that makes everyone think." Silas Calloway, my father, remained silent, but I saw him purse his lips and look down at his plate. For years, I didn't know if he understood what I had experienced that night or if he believed my stories. But one day, as we were working on the car together, he said something that surprised me. "Your mother used to say that a life without purpose is a wasted life," he said, almost as if he were talking to himself. I looked at him, and in that instant, I knew he also had his own questions and internal battles. The near-death experience not only taught me how to live selflessly, but it also showed me that the true power of life lies in cultivating relationships and building something meaningful for others. Faith, for me, was no longer something tied to empty rituals, but a daily commitment to act with truth and compassion, and that, I realized, touched people in ways I never imagined. As the years passed, my message found space in community meetings and even in some churches open to personal stories of transformation. People wanted to hear about the night I saw priests burning in the fire for their hypocrisy, but I always made a point of showing that the most important lesson was about authenticity, about living so that every action and word was true. Today, as I remember the night I almost lost my life, I feel deep gratitude, not because of pain or fear, but because of the awakening that gave me a new chance to be someone better, to serve, to live with a purpose that resonates not only with me, but with everyone around me. And, more than anything, I understood that God, that being that many see as distant, is closer than we could ever imagine, observing, feeling, and loving each of us in every small choice we make. If you like this beautiful spiritual testimony, leave a like, comment on your impressions, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to activate the notification bell to watch each new video and help us spread this message to a greater number of people. Until next time.